And they were so legitimate that they used to have business cards, and until 2018, there was a monthly fan magazine. Now, there are weekly magazines that are kind of like sleazy tabloids that still have like, 5 or 6 pages of Yakuza news in them.
Like a hostile kind of?
Kind of hostile, right? But it's Japan is very xenophobic. So if you're a foreigner, it's really hard to find a place that will rent to you. But there are these substrata kind of old places that will rent to foreigners because money is money.
Right.
I lived there for about a couple months, and then I ran into someone in the middle of the night on their bicycle. We struck up a conversation. He introduced me to this Zen Buddhist priest he was teaching English to. The Zen Buddhist priest, Ryogen-san, and I hit it off. And then after about 3 months, he was like, you're a student. You're clearly interested in Japanese culture. We have an empty room upstairs that's meant for monks, but no one wants to be a monk because it's a huge financial boom. So if you're welcome to stay there, the rent would be cheap. And, if you help out now and then, maybe you don't even have to pay rent at all. And I said, that's great. And it was a lovely arrangement. The only conditions were I had to go to Zazen, which is sitting meditation, every Sunday. It started at 7 sharp, which means you had to be there at 6:30 and get to be ready.
What'd you have to do for that?
Well, you have to meditate for about like 90 minutes, and then afterwards you have green tea and cakes, and there's a little bit of a sermon, and then you talk to the neighbors. It was a great way to learn Japanese. However, because there's this kind of Pavlovian thing that happens, if you always have green tea and sweets after you've been sitting in Zazen for, up to 90 minutes with some breaks, you get this sort of reaction is that my knees start to hurt whenever I have green tea. It's like the Pavlovian reaction. It's like I can't drink green tea without like this pain going up and down my knees. Anyway, so that was a really good experience. So I'm by this time I'd been there 2 years as an exchange student because I extended a year. And Sophia University, which is called Jochi Daigaku there, is really respected. So I just transferred. And I was like, this Japan is such a weird, it is a weird country. I mean, if you come from the United States, it's such a different culture that's like, I'm staying.
Did people start to respect you though? Like you mentioned, it's like a little xenophobic towards people that aren't from there. Like, did they start to respect you as you were taking parts in the customs and really learning the language? And they're like, oh, he's cool.
Sure. In your own little community, you can be accepted. And, people may forget that you're a foreigner and they don't remind you about it, and they treat you like as good or bad as anybody else. I think that some people get disillusioned because they'd expect that to happen wherever you go. But, I mean, is there any country in the world where you can just walk into a neighborhood and people greet you? I mean, if you're from New Jersey and you've got a New Jersey accent and you move to Manhattan and you're talking in a New Jersey accent, you think everyone's going to treat you like,
I mean, it's
friendly.
close enough. We'll be all right. We'll be all right.
I mean, but are you fully accepted, right?
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
I mean, if you're a redneck and you go to Harvard, you think, there's still not sort of kind of like.
That's a good example. Yeah.
I mean, there is, so in Japan, if you learn the language and the customs, and also because, I mean, I'm living in a Zen Buddhist temple, so I have to behave myself. I have the same haircut now for like 30, 35 years.
Looks good.
So I look very clean cut, right?
Yeah.
No hipster beard. Was most of the time I was wearing a suit and tie because I was teaching English on the side, and you had to do that.
Oh, you had to wear a suit and tie.
Oh yeah. I mean, that was expected. I mean, if you ask me what has changed the most about Japan since I arrived there in like 1988, is it used to be just you saw a flood of Japanese men in like dark blue, navy blue suits and ties, and that was the norm.
And now they wear Tommy Bahama pineapples.
Yeah, well, true, because it's global warming. But actually, it is acceptable. I don't know if this is Tommy Bahama.
Well, I was giving you credit. If it was Tommy Bahama's legit.
It is rayon, so quality material. Thank you.
It looks good. It's a good vibe for camera too. I feel like that'll be good for the thumbnail. So people will like that. They'll click that. So you get somewhat ingrained in the culture, and then after you finish university, you decide to stay there though.
So Japan is Japan has a kind of weird system for hiring people. Most people get their jobs before they graduate from college. So you sort of secretly have this job hunting season. There's an official job hunting season, and there's the unofficial job hunting season. And you go to these interviews with various corporations and you hope that they offer you a job. And then if they do, then your last year of school, you're just killing time.
Right.
So in my case, I got a job offer from Sony Music Entertainment, which is our Sony Computer Music Entertainment. I forget what the name was. So I had like a year of school left. And I was like, okay, I am like everyone else in the world. I am lazy. And if I don't apply myself, I'm not going to have the level of Japanese that I want, because I feel like at the job I'm going to be doing for Sony, I'm going to be using English more than I'm using Japanese. So I was writing for the school newspaper in Japanese just to improve my Japanese. I feel very sorry for my editor, Inukai-san, who had to correct my terrible Japanese. But I mean, it did get better. And, they were all going like, yeah, we're going to, get a job as reporters. And I'm like, well, how do you do that? And they say, well, every newspaper has these newspaper examinations, like an SAT. It's kind of standardized, different depending upon where you're applying. And, if you prep for them and you do well, then you go on to the interviews. And if you do well in the interviews, then they offer you a job. And I was like, well, that sounds interesting to me. So I enrolled in a couple classes, like at the community center. I bought a couple textbooks and I prepared for the examinations. And I took one for the Yomiuri Shimbun, which is this conservative newspaper, but it was at the time the largest newspaper in the world.
In the world?
In the world. 10 million readers a day.
Whoa.
That's, suck on that, New York Times. Now, the joke was there are 10 million copies published a day. There's not necessarily 10 million copies read a day, but there were 10 million copies printed a day. And went through that whole interview process. And it very much like is in the TV show. That's very realistic,
Your HBO show.
The HBO show.
Yeah.
And they offered me a job. And I was like, yeah. I'm thinking, like Sony's job is not interesting. This is interesting. And the first thing, and when they hired me, they said, okay, everybody starts on the police beat, and you are no exception. So we are going to send you to Saitama, which is just outside of Tokyo. It is sometimes called the New Jersey of Japan. No offense to New Jersey.
Yeah, what's the connotation here? I don't like that.
The connotation is that it's like, that if Tokyo is cool, that Saitama isn't so cool. It's on the outside of.
Right.
I am not the one saying it. I'm just telling you.
It's like the Rhode Island.
Yeah. It's the Rhode Island
or Connecticut.
Okay. But there's a lot of crime there, and a lot of organized crime.
Connecticut. Yeah.
Yeah, and so they sent me there, and the first year we're on. I think people have this idea that like I was really into the Yakuza, like I'm fascinated in them, and that's kind of the TV show vibe. But no, I didn't know anything about them. It wasn't part of my life.
You didn't know anything about the Yakuza?
Didn't I? I like what I would see in a newspaper article, right? I had a very surface understanding. Of course they exist, right? Of course you know that if you watch the news, they come up a lot.
For people who aren't familiar with them and haven't seen the stories on them over the years, can you just give a brief history of when they started and what they're all about?
So we'll work our way backwards because it's easier to understand.
Yep.
When you talk about the Yakuza, you're talking about 24 different groups located in Tokyo that have turf and territory all over Japan. They make their money through extortion, finance, fraud, drugs, and legitimate companies as well. They all claim to be humanitarian organizations. Because they are legal groups in Japan, you can look up the address of their headquarters on the National Police Agency webpage. And they were so legitimate that they used to have business cards, and until 2018, there was a monthly fan magazine. Now, there are weekly magazines that are kind of like sleazy tabloids that still have 5 or 6 pages of Yakuza news in them every week, but you don't have these glossy, giant 200-page. Yeah, this is full of information. Historically, they were 2 groups. They called them the Bakuto, which were federations of gamblers, and there were the Tekiya, which were federations of street merchants. So like wandering street peddlers and wandering gamblers, and they would set up little casinos kind of like in the local communities, and people would pay them money, and sometimes they would pay them protection money. Then after the Second World War,
Yeah.
they really, there was a period of time in Japan where the police were not empowered to arrest or deal with third-party nationals. Let me explain this easy. Japan was an imperial nightmare, so they colonized Korea, colonized Taiwan,
Right.
colonized China. They brought a lot of those people over to Japan as slave labor, and then when the war ended, GHQ, the Americans were like, you can't arrest these people. You leave them alone for the
Right.
time being. And so they were like, hey, Japan, payback time. So they started running the black markets. They started creating gangs. Police couldn't touch them. So these Yakuza who came back, especially in Tokyo and Kobe, sort of formed the sort of vigilante groups, and they sort of took back power. A year passed. The police were empowered to deal with the foreigners. And they stayed, running and the police sort of like, okay, we owe you one.
Right.
And also the thing that they did was very smart. They went to these Korean gangs and Taiwanese gangs, and they said, you guys are good businessmen. Why don't you work with us? Why don't we work together? I mean, you don't, the police can come down on you like a load of bricks, but we recognize your power. It's a meritocracy. If you'll pledge your loyalty to the Oyabun, which is like the father figure, you're welcome. So there was lots of mergers and acquisitions.
Right.
Which is why actually these days 30% of the Yakuza are Korean Japanese. There's another 30% that belong to what were called the Burakumin. So Japan used to have an outcast class. Japan sort of had a caste system. And the people who worked in dealing with slaughtering animals or leather works or unclean jobs were considered untouchables. And, the Yakuza don't discriminate. So that also became a place where they were welcome. I mean, I think that's, pretty standard where a lot of organized crime groups begin because you have a marginalized
That's right.
community and they welcome them and let them, rise up according to their power.
Yeah, and they start out of some, like all crime, they start out of some sort of economic disadvantage.
Yeah.
Right? So you look at the Italian-American mafia here and the Jewish mob and the Irish mob, like they started because they were packed like sardines in these little neighborhoods right here, and everyone shunned them in America, and so they did this.
I have an uncle who was allegedly Meyer Lansky's right-hand man.
Who was your uncle?
We just don't talk about it in the family. You
Well,
can
we
look
talk
it up.
about it
No,
now.
we're not talking about it here.
Well, you can't just bring that up on the podcast.
I can.
That's like saying he was the right hand of like the god of organized crime.
Allegedly.
Like Meyer Lansky was allegedly ahead of the Jewish mob.
Allegedly head of the Jewish mob. People have said many things about my uncle. He's just a nice guy. That's all.
Okay, all right.
Okay, but
Can we Google that? Jake Aldestein's uncle Meyer Lansky. But keep going.
Okay. So the Yamaguchi-gumi, which is easiest to explain because it's the biggest. I mean, it's been the biggest for a long time. At one time, they had 40,000 members. That was founded in 1915. So it's been around for over 100 years. It started as a kind of labor union on the Kobe docks and then moved to extortion and protection, loan sharking. And then when the war ended, Taoku Kazuo, who is called the godfather of godfathers, was like, okay, we've kept the peace here. We have all these young people just out of, all these soldiers who are just back from the war. Let's go into business. Like, let's, and he told his people, he told his members, we're going, of course we're going to run the black markets, and of course we're going to engage in illegal things and collect protection money, but it's also important for us to have a legitimate business. So the Yamaguchi-gumi is actually a corporation. They have this huge chunk of real estate in Kobe, and you can get the real estate deed for that property, and it's owned by a corporation with the members of the organized crime group on there as listed, and they are supposedly running parking lots and golf club management and other assorted activities,
which they might actually be doing that.
But they might actually be doing,
but it's all the stuff behind it.
They ran one of Japan's largest talent agencies for many years, Kobe Genosha. In addition to that, they had construction companies and other companies, and the Korean group that they took over, the Yanagawa Gumi, in Osaka, set up not only construction companies and entertainment companies, they took a chunk from every single business in the area, including people who were like selling, meat skewers on the street.
Oh, they're going after everybody.
But everybody paid. And that was kind of their business model. I mean, it got so, and the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, which has been ruling Japan since the 50s, almost uninterrupted from maybe a period of 2009 to 2012, they were out of power. That was also funded by a Yakuza associate, Kodama Yoshio, and Abe's grandfather, who was a war criminal, Kishino Bosuke, who also was heavily in debt to the Yakuza. I mean, so when you have your leading political party founded by the Yakuza, you can see why they are sort of tolerated for many years.
Tied and tied.
Tied and tied.
Absolutely.
Watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.